So let's talk a little bit about creating simple virtual machines. In this video, we're going to talk about host and virtual machine hardware limitations, and we'll also talk about some of the things that we need to be aware of as we start thinking about placing some virtual machines on this infrastructure. So in terms of what VMware is capable of doing, or at least what it's capable of doing as of ESXi 6, is 6 to 12 terabytes of memory, 480 processor cores. You know, that's quite a lot. That should give us the ability to either run many small VMs or a small number of large VMs. Potentially, we can have virtual machines with around 4 terabytes of memory and 128 virtual CPU cores. So that's pretty significant, and we can create some very, very large machines. Now, there are some limits. Even if I start creating very small virtual machines, the 1 or 2 CPUs and, 1 or 2 gigs of RAM, then, you see that there is still a limit of 1,024 VMs per host, and also 4,096 virtual CPUs per host, or virtual CPU cores per host. You can see we can also make VMDKs up to, just about 62 terabytes and put them onto 64 terabyte VMFS volumes. We also have things like virtual volumes, using NFS or other mechanisms that might not require a VMFS volume. So that could be different. And you can see we can have about 4 to 24 network adapters, depending on their type, brand, and whether they're gigabit or 10 gigabit or 40 gigabit or something like that. And then our virtual machines can have up to 10 network interfaces as well. So that is quite a lot. Up to a certain point, we might never create virtual machines that large. I mean, there's a lot of things that ESXi supports that really wouldn't even necessarily be able to accommodate those kind of resources. Anyway, I'm thinking of some of the legacy operating systems you might be dealing with, NetWare and OS2. We don't really care. I mean, if I create a DOS virtual machine, I don't need 128 CPUs on it, that's for sure. But really what we get is the ability to virtualize x86 or x64, so 32-bit or 64-bit, or I suppose potentially even 16-bit or 8 on x86 or x64 hardware. There's pretty much everything ever put out for that platform can be supported inside VMware. Either runs inside VMware or is actually supported inside VMware, and basically pretty well every version of Unix, every version of Linux, plus things like Windows and NetWare and OS2 and DOS are well supported, going back to very old versions as well as the newer, more modern stuff. Depending on what you're doing with those OSs, there may be tweaks and things that need to happen, running DOS in a virtual machine on very modern hardware. That could be a little weird, right? So we may have to do some things to make, OS2 work correctly or whatever. But generally speaking, it's pretty easy to do. And then what we really have to decide is how many eggs can I put safely in this basket? How many virtual machines is reasonable to put onto this host? And it might be 100 and it might be 5. I mean, it might be 500 or it might be 10 or whatever, right? So we have the ability to oversubscribe, and this is like how every airline in the world operates. They sell more seats than they actually have seats in the plane on the assumption that not everybody actually shows up for their flights. Oversubscription is potentially a good idea. We have to think about capacity planning, and we need to make sure that we have compatible patterns of activity effectively, where maybe some of my virtual machines are busy sometimes, and then other virtual machines are busy at other times, and then I can achieve very high resource utilization rates without having to provide a lot of redundant capacity that's not always used. So great. I mean, then this was really the major driver of virtualization initially, is to take lots of old small VMs, probably 32-bit VMs. Probably they can only support a few gigs of RAM anyway, and maybe 1 or 2 CPUs is all they ever had back then anyway. Now we may end up creating a lot of larger VMs. There's a lot of things that virtualization gives us that are valuable, even if it's not cramming a whole bunch of virtual machines into one box. There's still lots of flexibility that it offers us in terms of deployments and in terms of disaster recovery and all these other things, right? Basically, the main thing we need to be able to do is make sure that when we start getting into resource contention problems, that VMware has a way to influence or direct what happens inside the virtual machines so that we can make, multitasking within an operating system is already complicated enough, but now we need to do that between the virtual machines, and we don't have the direct control that the guest operating system has in terms of things like thread manager and memory manager and all that sort of stuff. I mean, we do, but we don't have the same kind of visibility. So we need something called VMware Tools to really provide us with all the drivers that are going to provide those system interfaces so that ESXi can do some of the traffic cop type features that it needs to be able to do. There's other things that you can do, and we'll talk about that in other videos around reservations and resource limits and so on. But first thing absolutely to do is to get VMware Tools installed. So this gives us, for really all these supported operating systems, is a set of drivers and services that provide us the ability to integrate the host with the guest. And this can be simple things like doing shutdown and restart commands in a safe and graceful way, but also includes things like the memory balloon driver, which can be used to create false demand inside of a VM in order to influence how it's going to do swapping and paging. So as of VMware Tools 10, the VMware tools don't particularly go with the version of ESXi that they're running on, where previously that was the case. Or there's also VMware tools for VMware Workstation and so on. So typically they would be tied to a product release. Generally speaking, a lot of this was tied back more to VMware Workstation release numbers. You see we're already at VMware Tools 10, but we're talking about ESXi 6. So they've already not really exactly been tied to the release of ESXi particularly anyway. But now we have a complete separation of those things. So VMware tools will get updated completely separately. This can cause us potentially some issues we'll talk about in a second. And a lot of Linux distributions now also include their own OpenVM tools package, and this makes life a little bit easier. Installation of VMware tools on Linux was always done with like a Perl script, so it was never really super safe in terms of, whatever distribution you might be using and how, they happen to do things. In the event that your Linux distribution doesn't support OpenVM tools, then you still have the option to use the traditional VMware tools package, and you can take a look at the operating system specific packages that you can download from VMware. Typically, installing VMware tools is pretty easy to do. If you go into, the console window of a VM, we can go to the guest menu, say install VMware tools, and this basically pops up, or attaches anyway, a CD DVD image to that virtual machine. It may or may not come up automatically. We may need to mount it. Auto run, for example, on Windows, it may even run automatically. On Linux, typically we need to mount it, we need to extract it, and then we need to run the Perl script to actually get it installed. Unless it's already there for you. And OpenVM Tools is completely supported. And actually, VMware recommends that if OpenVM Tools is available, you should leave it installed and you should use it. And they actually don't support machines without having it installed. So that should cover it. The main thing to do is make sure that VMware Tools is installed and that it stays up to date, or at least stays relatively up to date anyway. So VMware Tools provides us with things like the heartbeat so that ESXi can tell what's going on with that VM. Also does things like changing, cursor and resolution and so on when we're using the remote console. Depending on how you've configured this, you may even also have scripts that get run as part of a startup or shutdown or taking a snapshot or cleaning up a snapshot. We could potentially do time synchronization, although this is potentially troublesome. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And when we take snapshots, it's also going to integrate with the Windows Volume Shadow Copy services to do that snapshot safely. And we'll talk about snapshots in another video. So it also includes a number of drivers. And like I was saying, probably the most important one is the balloon driver. The ones that you're really going to see most often is the video driver and the network driver and the SCSI driver, and then, other stuff like audio and shared folders and so on. Some of this stuff actually is really only for VMware Workstation. You can't do shared folders on ESXi. You can't do thin print on ESXi and so on. But anyway, provides the drivers that are required. When you do the installation, you can, pick typical or, complete or custom, and then you can choose whether you want the VMware Workstation stuff installed or not. Maybe you do. Maybe you move this VM back and forth. It's testing and development or something. You need to keep VMware Tools updated. It's no longer directly tied to the releases, as I was saying. When you do go into the console, you say like guest install VMware Tools, that's going to do it from something called the product locker on ESXi. Yeah, that's not going to have VMware Tools available, or not VMware Tools 10 available because of, the changes to the release model. If you want to update it, it's possible to do it. If you take a look at the link here, basically updating to VMware Tools 10 must read. You must read it. So it really is important, and it's going to tell you more about how to handle those kind of situations. Although they don't really give you a great solution for this, it is sort of possible to do it. What you really should do is just kind of maybe even ignore the stuff on the menu and just install the tools package directly from V or something like that. So yeah, you could install it manually. You could put in your templates and your images. You can set the VM to always check for updates, but that's really just checking the product locker so that every time you restart the VM, it looks for new versions of the tools. People have been doing this for quite a while. Like I said, if your product locker is not getting updated, then that might not be useful to you. And maybe you've got some other mechanism to deploy these. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about keeping your guests up to date. It all depends on your personal preferences and how well set up you are to do software updates for different platforms, or if you want to do something in a virtual machine specific way that's not specific to either Linux or Windows or whatever else you might be using. But basically, what it really comes down to is either using something like vSphere Update Manager to do things in a vSphere-centric way, or using either the existing repositories that might already exist for Linux, or maybe using some of the Microsoft-specific software distribution tools, Group Policy or System Center Config Manager, or something along those lines. Take a look at this link, 6 methods for keeping VM tools up to date that's up on the VMware blog site, and it'll give you a pretty good breakdown of the advantages and disadvantages to the different approaches. So we'll take a look at the demo where we're going to set up a Windows virtual machine. You're going to see it's all pretty straightforward. I've already connected to my host using the vSphere client. I'm going to go over into the inventory view, and I don't have any virtual machines yet, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. I'm just going to right click, say new virtual machine, and then I've got some options. So I can choose typical or I can choose custom. If I do typical, depending on what kind of operating system I tell it I'm running, for older operating systems, it's probably just easier to emulate something that they already know about. I'm going to choose custom since it's going to give us more options and more interesting things to look at. So for custom, I'm just going to go ahead and provide a virtual machine name. I guess I'll call this Win2K12R2-1, creative along those lines, and click next. And then I have to decide where I want to place it. So there's a local data store on this host. Of course, if I had a host that was part of a cluster, then I need to differentiate which data stores are local, which data stores are actually out on the SAN, and what are available for the cluster and all the rest of it. So you'll notice if I look through these data stores, I can tell whether it's something accessible to a single host or something that's actually shared between multiple hosts. So I only have the one data store. I don't really have a lot of choice to make. I'm just going to go ahead and click next, and then to ask me for the virtual machine version that I need to use. So depending on whether I need to move this virtual machine between different versions of ESXi, or maybe even between ESXi and VMware Workstation or VM Player, then I've got some options. So I'm just going to leave it at 11 because I don't need to move back and forth between ESXi 6 and VMware Workstation 10 or earlier, or with ESXi 5 or 4 or anything like that. And then I'm going to tell it that I'm using Windows Server 2008 R2, 64-bit. You can see it's a little bit cut off. I've chosen a large Windows font size just to make it a little bit easier for you to read. But that's, not ideal, but you wouldn't normally see that. And I can choose, a whole bunch of different Linux varieties. And we also have, some generic options. If it's not, a well-known Linux or something along those lines, you can see that you can choose lots of different appliances and other software that comes from vendors is Linux-based in some way, but it's not really one of those popular distros. And also all kinds of different support for other x86, x64 oriented operating systems, including ESXi itself. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick Windows here, which is fine, and leave it at Windows 2012 R2. Actually, we don't have an option for 2012 R2. I'll just leave it at 2012. So generally speaking, between sockets and cores, we really would potentially increase the number of cores and reduce the number of sockets, primarily to get around licensing restrictions that might be in place on our guests. But generally speaking, you should prefer sockets over cores from a performance perspective because it works more effectively, and NUMA particularly doesn't work properly as you start increasing the number of cores. You start breaking down some of the NUMA associations that are supposed to help us improve performance. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 gigs of RAM. I don't really have a lot of memory allocated to these ESXi virtual machines. I'm just going to choose one NIC, and I'm going to leave it connected to the default VM network that's already been created. And in this case, I'm going to use the Intel E1000E driver, but I could also use the VMXNet 3 driver, which is a para-virtualized device. And we get the same thing actually for SCSI adapters. And you'll see I have a choice here for VMware Para-Virtual, which is very similar option. So we've got a driver that's highly optimized for a virtual environment as opposed to emulating a physical device. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave these as is, and I'm going to create a new virtual disk, and I'll make it 40 gigs, which is fine for what I'm going to do. And I'm going to say that it's thin provisioned, so it may or may not ever get to 40 gigs. I don't necessarily want to allocate that disk space for it. It's a, test machine. I'm not too concerned with it. It's not production, so why not save some space if I can? But you'll see I also have the option thick provision lazy zeroed and thick provision eager zeroed. So the primary difference between lazy zeroed disks and eager zeroed disks is that eager zeroed disks, I'm going to need to wait here while it actually goes in and initializes every block associated with those files. So obviously on a small virtual disk, that's not going to take too long. On a very large disk, then it certainly could. In comparison with a lazy zero disk, what will happen is we'll actually wait for the operating system to allocate that block, and then we'll zero out that block before the virtual machine is able to use it. Now, when virtual machines are first built, they're going to start allocating and assigning a lot of these blocks on demand, so that won't perform as well. But after that, then, if you have relatively light access, then this additional zeroing activity shouldn't really have too much of an impact. But if you're going to do things like run a Microsoft cluster inside of VMware, then you need to use an eager zero disk, and you're going to have to wait while it builds that disk and initializes it. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at thin provision, and I'm going to leave it with the virtual machine. There's no real reason to store them separately, but I might want a virtual machine with multiple virtual disks and distribute them amongst multiple different data stores. Sure, but those would really be disks that I add after I've already created the virtual machine. So I'm going to leave this one, main system disk with the virtual machine. And I can also choose the virtual device node, which is not really super interesting importance, but basically we can have up to 4 SCSI adapters. Each of those adapters can have up to 15 devices, and I can associate them here. And if you do find yourself in a situation where you have to add many disks to your virtual machines and they're going to have high I/O, then what you really should be doing is distributing those disks across multiple different SCSI controllers in order to give the best performance. Now, you can do 15 devices per SCSI controller and up to 4 SCSI controllers per virtual machine. But again, if you had, let's say, 12 disks, then you'd be better off distributing those across the 4 SCSI controllers than just attaching them to the one SCSI controller. Once again, if you're going to also be running things like a Microsoft cluster inside of VMware, then you're also going to need to do specific things about the shared bus SCSI controllers that you're going to use for shared disk access between the cluster nodes. You'll see I also have the option for independent mode. So if I take a snapshot of this machine, it won't snapshot the disk. If I only have one disk and I put it in independent mode, then I'm really not doing very much with snapshots. But if I have multiple disks, I might want to set other disks for independent mode. However, even if I only have the one disk, setting it to independent mode allows me to specify a non-persistent mode so that when I turn this virtual machine off, it actually loses its changes. In the summary page, it just gives us a listing of what we've told it, what operating system we've declared, what hardware we've declared. I'm just going to go ahead and click Finish. So I'm just going to right-click on that virtual machine. I could do the client device. I could also do the host device. Neither of these work very well. The client device is slow and doesn't generally work. And the host device is going to require me to go over to the server and actually have a CD/DVD in it, or, attach a USB or something to the server. It's not really what I want to do. Best performing option, most flexible option, best to use in a cluster environment, put them on an NFS file share or something. We can use data stores to store our ISO files, and that makes our life much, much easier. But let's pick that ISO image and say that I want to have it connected at power on. When we boot this virtual machine, we'll see that it goes through pretty much standard type boot process with a virtual BIOS and, everything that goes along with that. And then that actually happens pretty quick these days, so we'll probably miss it, but it will boot straight into the Windows installation process. And from there, I install as I normally would. So the installation's finished. I've got a typical sign-in prompt. Now, if I try to press Control-Alt-Delete here, though, it's going to give me trouble. So what's going to end up happening is Control-Alt-Delete is going to be trapped by the local Windows installation where I'm actually running the vSphere client, and it's not going to get transmitted into the virtual machine. Now, this is also made worse by the fact that I'm also running this inside a remote desktop edition in order to force the 720p aspect ratio. So what I'm going to do is, just to make my life easier, I'm going to take this virtual machine out of full screen mode with Control-Alt-Enter. And then on the VM menu, you'll see I've got the option under Guest to send Control-Alt-Delete. But typically what I would be doing is Control-Alt-Insert, I believe it is. Although I get this confused with Hyper-V a lot as well, but I believe it's Control-Alt-Insert. So in summary, proper preparation prevents predictable problems, or the short version here on the slide. Make sure that you're still thinking about capacity. You don't want to oversubscribe unnecessarily. You want to have reasonable workload assignments that have reasonable resources backing them, right? So we need to size virtual machines according to their needs. We need to be ready to potentially add or change hardware associated with virtual machines, or change reservations and limits, which we'll talk about later on. Definitely install VMware tools, keep it up to date. And if your operating system, Linux really, has an Open VM Tools package available, then install and use it. And in the next video, we'll take a look at virtual machine operations, power operations, going into standby, and a few other things as well.